With all the latest news and stories that matter right now in footy, it's Tom Browne's News.
Well, the footy community, good afternoon, collectively can't wait to watch Buddy try and get to 1,000 goals. Needs 4 at the SCG tonight. I'll talk about tonight later. But just off the top this morning, I want to discuss the latest concerning Dustin Martin and also discuss the fallout from the big game at Marvel last night. The Blues absolutely flying. In terms of Dusty, I haven't been in contact with Ralph Carr, his manager, this morning. Dusty's just resting at home, according to Ralph. Just needs some time out at the moment, obviously following the very tragic passing of his dad, Shane, in New Zealand over Christmas. There's not much more, I'm told, to the story than that. I've checked with Richmond today regarding his availability for Sunday. They're still unsure whether Dusty will play. Reading between the lines, I think there's a significant degree of doubt. Having said that, Dusty has been named in the side, so we'll find out over the weekend. And again, our thoughts with Dusty in terms of just going through that tough patch at the minute. A massive game at Marvel last night with all sorts of implications for the Blues. I think supporters can dare to dream this morning. Are they top 4 or top 6 material? It looks possible based on the fact that they've got key position players in all the right parts of the game, the ground, the defenders, the midfielders, the forwards. Great game last night for the Twin Towers. Mackay and Curnow kicked 9 goals between them. Great for Charlie Curnow. He's been luckless, kicked 5 goals last night. Carlton fans, and I think the broad footy community, love seeing that. Patrick Cripps, 35 touches with half his head bandage. He was absolutely enormous. And, of course, they've got Jack Martin and Adam Chera to return from concussion protocols next week. They'll be right to go. They're out of protocols as soon as today, I'm told. Of course, Michael Voss will also return. And a great endorsement last night for Ash Hansen. The Blues, I spoke to Brian Cook, their CEO, before the game. They reckon technically and from a strategy perspective, Hansen is right to go as a senior coach. Now, clearly, obviously, in the future, he'll work on things like leadership and all those types of things which naturally evolve. But I think it was a good endorsement for Ash Hansen, albeit on one game last night. For the Dogs, there are a couple of big stories, none bigger than Hayden Crozier, who was treated at halftime after he fainted. He was given an ECG, which I think is an electrocardiogram, and they just obviously checked the heart. Gary Zimmerman attended to him. I've checked with the Bulldogs this morning regarding how Crozier is tracking, and it looks like reasonably good news. They said, "Hi, mate, Hayden is feeling normal today. He didn't go to hospital last night. We'll monitor him over the next few days," but some good signs. So your mind does wonder sometimes in those situations to Dylan Robertson, who had very documented unlucky heart issues and the like, but at this stage, it looks like Crozier is okay. I thought the Bulldogs were a bit stiff last night. I mean, in the second half, they created plenty of opportunities, kicking 4 of the first 5 goals in the second half. Libba and McRae began to get on top in the midfield. They did a good job. Tim English is doing a lot of work by himself. I don't know how long he can keep going at that rate for. He's shouldering the load. They're missing Josh Bruce. But I thought the Bulldogs last night, well, they face Sydney now on Thursday night to avoid hopefully going 0-3 from their perspective. They're 0-2. They were in this position in 2020. And I just think they've been a little bit stiff now for 2 weeks in a row. Having said that, they've come up against some big opposition, but they were the key stories from last night. Some big developments on the concussion front. The AFL is now launching an independent investigation into the work, research and advice of one of the architects of its concussion policies, Dr. Paul McCrory. I've mentioned this story on this podcast this week. In terms of why the AFL is investigating Dr. McCrory, Dr. McCrory gave an enforceable undertaking to the medical board back in 2018. We don't know the reason for that undertaking or the terms of that undertaking, but McCrory didn't apparently alert the AFL, according to the league, in regards to that undertaking. And Peter Jess, the concussion campaigner, has been on record this week as saying at least 4 or 5 of his players have seen McCrory, including Daniel Venables, who I spoke to this week, since that time. Now, the implication there is we don't know what the medical undertaking was. We don't know the nature of it. We do know that it did preclude him from providing neurological services. So the AFL, with these questions in mind, and they're concerned about some of the questions as well, they also didn't know about the admitted plagiarism issue back in 2005. So they're going to conduct what they describe as an independent investigation into McCrory. Now, McCrory is also being investigated by the Medical Registration Board in regards to whether there's been a breach. Clearly, that registration board, you'd think, would now go and speak to the Venables family. Peter Venables has been on record this week. The Florey Institute, which is one of the lead neurological institutes, which has been in the past funded by the AFL, he's their lead researcher, McCrory. They're also investigating whether there's been any breaches. I'm not suggesting there has been. These are all subject to investigation, but it's a pretty sensational development that one of the key architects of the AFL's policies, some of the worldwide policies in recent years on concussion in McCrory, is now being investigated in relation to a potential breach of his practicing conditions. I asked Daniel Venables about this during the week, and one point he raised, which was a very good one, was that he feels a bit shortchanged if these allegations are true, because Macquarie oversaw the initial phase of his treatment for about 1.5 years when he got that brain bleed, and he doesn't want that to be wasted time, if you like. So there's a lot of big questions in relation to that. I've spoken to Peter Jess about this morning, and he's not entirely happy with the AFL suggestion of an independent investigation. And he did tell me this, which is an interesting sort of take on all this. He said, Tom, this is not only about Macquarie, this must be about the organisation that enabled this process to happen after repeated warnings to every level of the organisation, from the chairman to the CEO and CMO, that's the chief medical officers and their advisors. Anything but a Royal Commission will not get to the truth for this neurological disaster for thousands of AFL participants at every level of the sport: men's, women, children, elite country and suburban. This is Peter saying this. The chairman and the commission must step aside during this investigation process to ensure transparency, as thus far this has been sadly lacking universally in the AFL. Peter, that's signed off by Peter Jess. So Peter Jess still pushing for a Royal Commission into concussion. He's concerned about what's been happening in recent years and some of the warnings he's given the AFL. In fairness to the AFL, they have improved the return to play protocols, and they've called for this investigation. So they've done the right thing, obviously, by calling this yesterday. But it's a big issue. It's a big issue of potential liability, of potential negligence, and it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out in the next couple of months. Incidentally, Peter Jess also has a hearing at with VCAT on Monday, trying to get more data on the policy and the work cover investigation into the return to play protocols, which is the length of time you've got to miss due to concussions. There's a lot happening in that space. Some interesting selection news last night. Good news for the Cats. Jeremy Cameron back just 5 or 6 days after going to the Epworth Hospital, carted off with what looked like rib or kidney damage at one stage. So it's great news for the Cats. Mitch Duncan also back in the Cats side. For Hawthorn, Liam Shields has been dropped. I've checked with the Hawks. There's nothing unusual about that, apart from the fact that it's pretty rare that Liam Shields gets dropped. It's just because Bruce and McAvoy are back in the side. So it's just obviously a selection issue that Sam Mitchell has gone with this week. Jaden Stevenson also dropped from North Melbourne. Just an update on some research I've done this week. There's an interesting story that Damien Barrett revealed on the afl.com.au website, Triple M's own Damien Barrett. To summarise, it just explained that Joe Danaher's contract, new 2-year extension, hasn't been approved by the AFL as yet. It's quite complicated. It relates to the free agency compensation and whether there's been any breach on the part of any of Brisbane in terms of the way they've constructed that deal. They offered him an initial 3-year deal, and now they've extended that by 2 years. But I've checked with Brisbane this week, at least from their perspective, and they are adamant they did a 3-year deal just because he'd only played 9 games in 3 years. And given the fact that he played every game and didn't miss a session in the pre-season, they were happy to extend him on that basis. So they think that's the story, and there's nothing in that. I guess we'll know finally when the AFL to sign off on that 2-year extension. But that's at least Brisbane's position, which does make sense because obviously Joe came into it having not played, as they say, 9 games, my Brisbane sources, in 3 years. But they've extended it on that basis that he played every game and didn't miss a session in the pre-season. But that is an interesting story that Damien has had regarding Joe Danaher's contract, and it'll be interesting to see when the AFL officially sign off on that extension. But it does relate to the free agency compensation and whether the way the deal was arrived at basically gave Essendon, which they did get a first-round pick, excessive compensation. So that's an interesting issue that's been bubbling away. Buddy Franklin, of course, going for 1,000 goals tonight, needs 4. Selfishly, I sort of hope he'll get them when I'm working next Thursday night at Marvel, but it will be good to see. Hopefully he get that Buddy tonight at the SCG. Don't miss Triple M across the weekend. We'll be back with more on our podcast on Monday.